People gathered today aboard the U.S.S. Lexington to commemorate the 77th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The executive director of the Museum on the Bay, Steve Banta, took the stage to remember all those who lost their lives and thank those who served. And he gave a special thanks to the 3 Pearl Harbor survivors who were in the audience. With the passing of former President George H.W. Bush, Banta mentioned how the tragedy at Pearl Harbor compelled Bush to join the military.
And like many Americans, decided that he would do something about it. And the next summer he joined the Navy on his 18th birthday, and he was in flight school right here in Corpus Christi, Texas.
The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the memorial wreath and Amazing Grace performed by the Corpus Christi Pipes and Drums.